Good. So, welcome all. By way of some introductions, you have myself, Steve Hearsum, and Paul Sweeney, and also the lovely Andrew Grenfell, who you will see lurking here. And Andrew is somebody I know through my work and through the master's program that he was a participant on and I was faculty on. And he has foolishly agreed to help shepherd, herd, manage, whatever adjective best suits for this session, you all into breakout rooms and to manage the process, because with over 150 people signed up, albeit not all will turn up, clearly many will want to see the recording, we felt we needed an extra pair of hands. So Andrew may occasionally butt in or nudge us if we need some nudging around the if I can ask you to go on mute, just if you're in a public space, until such time as it's time to talk. Let's just see. Somebody's got their microphone on. Right, okay, brilliant. So let us begin. Welcome to this webinar. I'm Steve Hearsum. I'm the author of No Silver Bullet, Bursting the Bubble of the Organisational Quick Fix, and I'm delighted to be joined by Paul Sweeney, who is the author of Magnetic Nonsense, and has been playing in an adjacent space to me for the last year, we discovered, rather delightedly. Before we get into that and the meat of the session, because we're going to go at a reasonable lick to cover as much ground as we can and get you all involved. Just a bit of admin. Firstly, if you wouldn't mind putting your mics off, and unless otherwise engaged in the dialogue, that would be great. Cameras on if possible, just because it's more human and friendly, albeit there could be as many as 100 odd of us. Nonetheless, it does make it more human. We are going to use Slido. We're going to attempt to do that to make the Q&A a little bit more manageable. Or if there's something urgent during our conversation, you really want to butt in and say something, then by all means, throw a passing cat or small child at the screen, or use the Zoom raise hand function to grab our attention. The scaffolding and agenda for today, it's going to be a first chunk of me and Paul chewing on 3 or 4 of the key overlaps, I think it's fair to say, Paul, in our work. Then we'll get you into small groups before we use Slido to capture some of your questions and hopefully have a bit of a chew on those. Paul, anything else to say just at the outset?
Yeah, I think I saw an interesting quote today, and I thought it summed up pretty well, Steve, what we were kind of thinking about. It's from a guy called Guy P. Harrison, a US writer, and he says, appreciate the magnificent brain you possess, protect and nurture it, strive to be a good skeptic and critical thinker so that fewer hours of your precious life will be squandered on dead-end beliefs. Always try to think like a scientist so that you might better know truth from fiction. And I thought that I liked the sort of sentiment of that. It also reminded me of one from another American author who said, the brain is a wonderful organ. It starts working the moment you get up in the morning and doesn't stop until you get to work. So I thought, lovely. Those would be good starting places.
Great. And in a sense, the starting place where we overlap, and I just throw this up here so those of you who are not familiar with Paul or mine's work, Paul's book on the left with a link to it on Amazon, mine on the right with a link to it on Amazon. I think it's fair to say that we became aware of each other through our respective, I was about to say grumpiness, Paul, but certainly the questions we were asking about organizations and about leadership. And what I was going to suggest we do is, and you and I discussed this, is we're going to start by talking about really 4 themes. So the first thing we wanted to chew on was, what's the role of management consulting in nonsense? And I think nonsense is the word you use, Paul. It's not a word, interesting, that I used, I think, in my work. So, it very much sits with how you've been construing what's been going on. But we were going to start with, this is as a fractal of the nonsense problem, I think. So should we start with you? What do you see as the role of management consulting in creating nonsense?
Yeah, I think we almost have to go right back to evolution to start this conversation. So we have, as humans, we have a couple of cognitive biases that were left over from evolution. One is we have a deep aversion to uncertainty. And because uncertainty at one point in our evolutionary journey meant danger. So we don't like uncertain things. And the second is that we have a very high drive for sense making. You can see this in every sort of culture had a creation myth. So we always like as humans to try to explain what's happened so that we can try to predict the future. And consultants are very good at kind of exploiting these cognitive biases, and particularly the big consulting firms, which are, in my view, they're a giant Ponzi scheme, effectively. So what they do is they create fads that play to these biases that we have, stir up everybody, and then they sell consulting advice into the fad. And when the fad then turns out to be completely useless, they flip into the next one. My favorite example of that being about 3 years ago, Accenture put out a report saying that the metaverse was going to be the next greatest amazing thing in the world. The metaverse economy would be worth $13 trillion by 2030 and have 8 billion active users. And shortly afterwards, McKinsey put out their report saying something similar, that the metaverse economy would be worth $5 trillion. 80% of all transactions would be affected. 50% of live events would probably be on the metaverse. And of course, this just created a massive sense of panic. And the consulting firms spun up lots of consulting offers and advice. And then, there's, I think, Nicole, you're off mute.
No.
Thank you. And then, of course, lots of companies spent billions of dollars buying virtual land in the real estate. And of course, it all just fizzled out and was completely worthless in the end. So that for me was a great example. If I looked today on a US site called DAP Radar that tracks transactions in the metaverse, and I think there were about $150 worth of transactions in the past 24 hours in the metaverse. So on a quick reckoning, it would take somewhere around, I think, somewhere around 1 million years before we reached $13 trillion, like Accenture said we would by 2030.
So one of the things I loved reading your book was the way in which you evidenced this. My interest in the consulting industry, I think, was twofold. One was critiquing the business model. I mean, you use the language of Ponzi scheme. For me, the finders, minders and grinders model, it only succeeds the more fungible consultants you manage to parachute into organizations. And the other thing that strikes me is, I know many former and current consultants who've worked in large professional services firms who are actually very principled, ethical, and do good work. But many of the most ethical are no longer there because they became so frustrated at being asked to not build capability in their clients that they had to leave. But the thing that fascinates me is, in order for that to work, we all have to collude.
Yes.
So it's very easy to critique the consulting firms, but clients buy from them. And just to not let us all off the hook, those of us, because I know there's many on this call who are independents and internals, and some of you I've actually spoken to about this, that we are part of this dance as well every time we say to a client we're an expert in something when we know we're really not. So I guess the question for me here is, to what extent are we in some form of mass psychological delusion and in denial of our own anxiety, and we pretend that we know more than we do as consultants, and equally, clients often imagine they know less than they actually do.
Yeah, I think it's that was a bit in your book that I found really fascinating, was this collusion idea that everyone's sort of in this game and everybody knows about it, but we all pretend we're not playing it. And I do think you're right. That's an interesting part of the problem. This kind of nobody ever got fired for hiring PwC kind of thing. It has become very intellectually lazy, though, to let consultants do your thinking. And it's funny how many times you hear, oh, well, research from McKinsey says this, so we should do that. And I devoted a whole section of my book to rubbishing most of their research, which is basically just marketing dressed up as research. And some of it's incredibly shocking in its in how poor it is, but yet it seems to get traction because of the brand. Accenture, I think it was Accenture, yeah, issued a report saying that leading companies who put people at the heart of digital transformations achieved an 11% uplift in top line profit. And when you read the small print of the report, the way they identified leading companies was they used AI to assess the transcripts of earnings calls, looking for buzzwords about people and digital fluency. And that was the entire research methodology behind the report. Yeah. And, but somehow, once the report comes out from one of these big consultancies, it seems to just seep into organizations without question. And that maybe that's part of the collusion, is that I don't know whether the people are using it to reinforce what they believe already and validate that, or back up what they wanted to do anyway, or are they genuinely just not questioning it?
And I think, we'll move on to our next kind of thread in this soup. But I think your questions there, what comes to mind is those moments I've had conversations with usually former consultants where they've gone through their epiphany.
Yeah.
And I remember one of them saying to me, he was a former Accenture consultant, and for him the epiphany was being asked yet again to parachute in more bodies rather than build capability. It became an unbearable tear. But equally, having spoken to, I can vividly remember one consultant at a large firm who seemed unable to see how he was placing himself on a pedestal of greater knowledge than all his clients.
Yeah.
And almost not knowing not even admitting what he did not know.
Yeah, and there's a lot of pressure on consultants to demonstrate how smart and clever they are.
Absolutely.
To justify the $3,000 or $4,000 a day that they're being charged for.
Absolutely. So let's move to our next one, and we'll see how this all weaves together. So one of the other areas I wanted to explore was to use HR as an example. For me, you may have a different viewpoint. I don't want to kind of give HR a kicking. Some of my best friends are in HR. I know people who work in the field. Dave Ulrich, who very kindly wrote the foreword to my book, is deeply associated with the field, and he's a really interesting person in terms of somebody who does a lot of work to evolve and develop and reinvent and question and challenge and critique his own practice. But if we use HR as an example, is it a victim of wider organizational dysfunction and nonsense? To what extent is HR complicit? And the existential question, is it time to put it out of its misery?
I think it is both a victim of how we default to designing organizations in a very bizarre way, but it's also complicit. And I think I once was asked to attend a lunch of FTSE 100 HR directors. I don't know why they asked me, but to kick off the conversation, I stood up and said that I held HR responsible personally, or sort of professionally and functionally, for the decline in most of the things we enjoy about work in the last 20 years. And I suggested that the CIPD should be proscribed as a terrorist organization for the damage that these people have done to work. And that was met with an interesting silence for a moment. But I would say it's kind of sad, because actually most people go into HR because they genuinely think that it's about caring for people and looking after people. But they end up in a function that's actually, whose primary, focus seems to be about compliance and keeping their employers out of court, almost defending the organization against its people in the cases where things go wrong. And they are complicit in that. Also, I would say at least 80% of HR activity is completely pointless, and actually even worse than pointless. So values, purpose, the stuff they do on well-being, which has no effect, the pointless performance appraisals, the convoluted bonus and incentive structures they put in place that cause all kinds of bad behavior, all the nonsense they push out at vast expense. At least 80% of it, in my view, is completely pointless.
So I'm going to just throw out a question, and answers from anybody who has one in the chat would be fascinating. At a HR conference when I used to work at Rothley Park, this must have been 2014, I asked a panel of HR luminaries a question. and it wasn't my question. I'm not going to take credit for this. This is from a former consulting colleague of mine who sadly is no longer with us. And I asked them, I said, if HR didn't exist and we needed to create a new field or discipline to support clients in the here and now, would we create HR as we know it? And if it was, and would it be the same or different? And how would it be the same or different? And would we even call it HR?
Yeah.
Now, what was fascinating to me as I asked the question was I had hoped that some of them might go, it's an interesting question, or have an answer, but they couldn't engage with it. Jeff used the word in the chat earlier on about consultancies, about Teflon. The Teflon was in action there. It was too anxiety inducing to engage with that question.
Yeah.
But what is the field we might create if we were to say that all of the existing ones are too niche and too narrow?
An interesting one. And, I had quite interesting conversations online when I joined a long HR thread at one point about reinventing HR, and pointed out that there are companies like Boortzorg in the Netherlands who've now grown to 15,000 employees, and they don't have any HR department. They operate as a network of self-organizing teams where the teams hire, the teams fire, they manage their own performance, they deal with their own issues. They have about 20 coaches they can call on in the organization who can come and help them resolve any conflicts or disputes or issues they have. But beyond that, they have an admin kind of bit that does HR contracts, but otherwise they don't have any HR department, and there was a lot of angst and comments about that in the HR thread. So I think there are different ways to do this. I saw something pop up about somebody disagreeing with me that 80% of HR stuff is nonsense. I would say we don't have time to get into it today, but if you read the book, I will prove to you that values, the typical well-being stuff, performance management, all of those are nonsense, and there's really good academic validation behind those claims. But yeah, I think the HR needs to be reinvented, refocused, and I actually think HR could be the function that defends people against nonsense rather than is the entry point and execution partner for nonsense without question. And it will be more important to defend people with AI on the verge of, organizations are on the verge of doing some very dumb things with AI that will potentially affect a lot of people.
Yeah. So the one thing I just want, before we move on to our next thread, is just to say that my observation about HR is that it often gets a kicking when actually HR is only going to be as innovative and as radical as the leadership of the organization allows it to be. And most HR functions are a reflection of the system within which they sit. Add to that there's often a psychological splitting. And I see this with OD and change people as well. And this is with all compassion towards senior leaders who have a difficult job, but abdicating responsibility for some of the conversations they need to actually have themselves. And HR is often one of the first places where that will be shoved. So I think there's this double bind that HR find themselves in. They're kind of damned if they do, damned if they don't sometimes.
And I think we should acknowledge it's a difficult time to work in HR because everybody hates them and they're not quite sure how to get out of the kind of doom loop that they're in.
Yeah. So let's move to one of the bits that I found most fascinating, certainly reading your tome, which was heroic leadership, which I describe in my book. I take some of the kind of zombie idea from that wonderful article whose authors escaped me from a couple of years ago about zombie leadership. And for me, heroic leadership is the zombie form that simply refuses to die and gets reinvented and rebadged and relabeled, even with things that appear to be less heroic, like servant leadership and leader as follower, is still the heroic trope that underpins it. It's like what's the word? You've got the same chassis with a lovely new funky cover to it. So heroic leadership.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. It seems that we haven't really moved on from the kind of industrial era, industrial revolution area view of organizations. And there's kind of three themes that flow through most of our thinking on leadership. One is that, leaders can predict and control the future. Two is that organizations behave in rational and predictable ways. And yeah, and the third is that all you need is the right leaders with the right stuff, and then everything will be fine. And it's clearly ludicrous because I think the tenure of a CEO in many countries is now, it's a single digits, it's low single digit years. It's probably 2 to 3 years. It's similar to a Premier League manager now. I think it's 2 years is the average tenure. Um, but when it fails, as it consistently does, the uh, the new leader that comes in will bizarrely propose the exact same things as the one that just left. They'll say, "Oh, we need to, redefine our purpose, redo our values, make everyone accountable, blah 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 blah." And it's the amazing lack of original thinking. You think, it's the only time in my book I cursed because you just think paying you all those millions of pounds and you haven't got a single fucking original idea when you arrive. It's and then the circus goes around again. And it's really, if aliens came, what would they think? They would think we were all crazy.
Yeah, and that's something that, I mean, I credit Richard Hale for this, who I quote where he talks about the performative nature of much leadership development,
Hmm.
which is people like me and like many of the people on this session, we rock up to a nice venue to perform in our role as facilitator or consultant and bestow upon the participants our knowledge about ideas of great and good leadership, whilst the participants all rock up to consume this stuff and then go back into the mess and reality of their organization and very little changes because we're going through the performance of expert and consumer of knowledge. And
Yeah.
maybe the knowledge is not the point. There's something, a really interesting thread of exchanges on the chat, where some nice challenge to what at face value, Paul, is your kind of, my language, not yours, the kind of denigration and trashing of HR. But the bit I kind of want to pull out, my read of what you say is, this is not about HR, the people and the functions, so much as the models and theories and assumptions which they operate under.
Yeah, and
And
it's the herd-like nature of it all, that every single big company does exactly the same things that are never really fundamentally questioned. That
yeah,
that's my big issue. It's not. I like the HR people. They want to do good stuff. They want to care for people, but they are, there's just really no evidence of a lot of critical thinking in HR as a profession, and the CIPD is a stark example of that.
okay, we'll leave that little bombshell just to stew there. Light blue touch paper and withdraw.
Yeah.
In the time we've got, one more
Right.
conversational thread.
Just on the one more
Yeah,
thing on leadership.
yeah,
If you step back from it all, you would say we've had 150 years now to study leadership, right? We have more leadership coaches in the UK than GPs. When are we actually going to admit that it's not working? It's really like, how long is it going to take?
yeah. No, I agree totally. I agree totally. Um, so the last question um, from this little thread is this, because to me, much of what you and I kind of circle, Paul, and what we're wrestling with is fundamentally it's about change. You know, consulting firms are all about helping organizations change. HR is fundamentally about change, or certainly ensuring that if there is change, that it is not as painful as it need to be. Heroic leadership is actually about change. The hero will come along and fix or rescue or do whatever he or she does. Um, but that begs the question, what does it take to do change work well? And from my own point of view, it's one of the things I'm about to reveal in the next couple of weeks, the next book I'm writing, which is about what does it take to do change work well. And I'm writing it with an internal change person. So it's not just an external person chuntering on about it and not just an internal person chuntering on about it. It would be the kind of dual lens. And it strikes me often the need to do change work well is fundamentally misconstrued and misunderstood because it is about capability building, but it tends to be done or given to a group of people who are then often, once they've had their capability built, jettisoned. I've seen it happen several times. Hundreds of thousands of pounds spent on helping people to become better at doing internal change and consulting and work, but they are literally the first people to go through the consultation process. So what, in your view, does it take to do change work well?
I was thinking about this question. I think maybe it's not the right question, or maybe there's a precursor to the question, which is why do we need to change? And often the reasons that are given are extremely rational and efficiency driven. And it reminds me of, I saw Rory Sutherland had a great story about, how many billions of pounds Eurostar spent to shave 15 minutes off the journey from Paris to London. And he said, yeah, they asked the wrong question. What they should have done, for £1 million, they probably could have hired the world's best looking models to walk up and down the train giving out free glasses of champagne, and everyone would be really sad the journey was so short. There's something about we start in the wrong place, and then we approach it in the wrong way as well. So we compound the problem, I think.
Right. So I'm conscious of time. I kind of want to finish this bit with just picking up one comment from Alex, who I know, Alex Poppleton. And she says in the chat, is a key part of the nonsense the Anglo-Saxon industrial revolution of thinking that's so prevalent in the UK and the US? I'd say yes. And she then goes on to say, however, not everywhere is like this, not everywhere copies this lead. It's also deeply patriarchal. I'd agree, given that most of the stuff that gets quoted is written by white middle-aged men, like me and you, Paul. But we need to be careful that we don't project our own experience onto everything. And I would say that's a health warning. So even though me and you have differing degrees of strong opinions on these things, I'm certainly aware that I need to be challenged as much as to challenge.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. And I would welcome challenge. And I know one of the things in writing the book I tried to do was make it as evidence-led as possible. So I got like 16 pages of citations. So it's not just me, grumpy old boy shouting in the corner. I've tried to back up my views with solid evidence, but always open to challenge.
Yeah, and I think I don't feel moved to say this, but I think when I first met you online, as it were, my initial story was of somebody who was very grumpy and really angry. But somebody who's a friend and who I admire actually engaged with you and challenged you on something. And he said to me the other day when I spoke to him, I really respected Paul for how he actually engaged with that. I went, oh, I hadn't thought about that. And I think that's really important in all this stuff. We're not arguing for a new fixed position. We're arguing for a deeper inquiry. And in that vein, we're now going to shift gear. Andrew, could you set up the rooms for us? Whilst you do that,
they're ready.
Great. Before you hit go, here is just some prompts. You don't have to use these, but in the time we're going to give you, 10 to 15 minutes, what do you agree or disagree with? What are you noticing in the conversation or in yourselves? What questions are coming up? And what are the implications for you and for your clients and for your work? Feel free to use the Slido we've set up, so you can post and then vote on the questions you're most interested in us giving a bit of attention to. And we may well use any questions we don't have time for to fuel something that me and Paul follow up with as a written piece afterwards. So if you're happy with that collective hive mind, Andrew, would you like to do the honours and open the rooms?
Here they all come.
Brilliant. Welcome back. What we thought we would do is just quickly see if we can chew on as many of these questions as possible, and then end with a brief free-for-all. The first question that got one upvote was the feeling of the group is that this provocation doesn't actually help us get deeper into the behaviour we experience as consultants and helpers. I think my reflection on that was you can't get into the experience unless you've actually had the provocation to realise what the experience is you need to get into, if that makes sense. I think both me and Paul know that today was more likely to be a provocation rather than inquiry with the number of people that we've got. So if it is felt more provocative than anything else, I don't think, Paul, you and I are going to apologise for it. We kind of know that's the nature of the beast.
Yeah, I mean, I guess our hope was to start the conversation, not to kind of finish it.
Not to end it.
And I will say that you can really answer that question very well by reading Steve's book, because he goes into that in a lot of detail, that particular experience.
Yeah. And I agree absolutely that the behaviour we experience as this consultants and helpers is key to this, and it's where I spend a lot of my time doing my work at the moment. But I'm not going to say anymore because that's too much like a sales pitch. Go and find me on LinkedIn and find out what I do, and then I'll happily talk to you more about it. We wanted to pick up that one about the different fields. So I think we said, Paul, I quickly picked that up. How do these things manifest differently in different communities? My view on this is, and I'll talk about this in chapter 9, it's a bit like, for those of you who've seen Monty Python's Life of Brian, it's the People's Front of Judea and Judeans People Front scene. That there is too much emphasis placed on the differentiation between the different fields. Because if you look under the skin of what many of these fields have to do, HR is often about change. Organizational development is about change. Org design is about change. Digital transformation is about change. And what it is required of us in terms of doing that work well is remarkably similar. And it's when we miss the fact that actually it depends on relational processes and understanding human behavior and human systems that we get our knickers in a twist. I'm increasingly label agnostic. I notice that the practitioners who seem to be most able to deal with the mess and often have, in my view, entirely subjective, some of the most useful skills are the ones who are the most agnostic about their labels.
No, bullshit.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Rubbish.
Say more.
Well, I've said it's subjective, Alex. That's what I notice. Right. So I don't expect you to agree with me, but it's what I notice. So do you want to say, Alex, why you don't agree?
I think it was Nicole.
Was it Nicole?
No.
Oh no. Okay, you're.
It was me. I'm sorry. I didn't realize I had my microphone on.
Own thoughts. I'm just really interested in. Yeah, that it was a dismembered kind of voice almost, Alex, but really curious. There was a passion behind that one.
Yeah.
Well, I think the difference for me is not necessarily the label. It's the thinking, the training, the self-reflection, the years of working on yourself. And that isn't necessarily the same for everybody. And the labels don't necessarily tell you who's done what. But I think to say that it's all the same.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm actually agreeing totally with you, Alex. That's my point.
Right.
That's my point precisely. Yeah. So the work, to become good at that work, is not dependent on the label.
No, but I think the labels are often a shorthand for how do you find people that have done the work.
Yeah. And my view is that we pay too much attention to those.
Yeah.
So
perhaps.
So that's
and it's also not uniform across different places,
totally.
right? You know,
Totally.
what's true in the market in the UK is not true in the States, not true in Europe.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important to say that everything that we're saying here cannot be assumed to be universal truths. But I think what we're trying to do is to open up a conversation about some of the shibboleths in management thinking and in organizational change practice that are often not challenged enough. And that conversation is an important one to have. To pick up one of the other ones, Paul, any of the other questions that we wanted to particularly pick up on Slido?
Yeah, I love the one that said the source material. Well, sorry, I'm in agreement, much agreement of the views and opinions shared. It resonates deeply and terrifies me at the same time. And actually, that is really consistent with lots of the feedback we've had about this. And then it goes on to say, I need to rethink how I make my livelihood. And that is a real challenge, I think, is that if you are making your livelihood really well in the current system, even though you know that it's not really working, I can see that does cause a real challenge.
There's the question that's popped in at the end is the way the provocation is set up just adding to the nonsense. My story from the frame of the question is that the person who's posted that, and you're welcome to break cover, is that you think it is. I don't know. You'll have to decide for yourselves is my answer. That's not our intent. That's not our intent, and I'll leave it as that.
And I think another good question from Kathy, is it less about change and more about constant evolution? And I've actually been reflecting on this one, Kathy, and I think I'm really just I'm amazed at how little evolution is actually happening in organizations. We're running them all, nearly all of them, the same way as we did, 10, 15, 20 years ago. So it seems like evolution has kind of stopped. And my wish is that evolution would somehow restart when we come to think about how we run and design organizations. And it's amazing that we are not testing different constructs, in my view.
Any other? Are we going deeper or further away? Again, I think that's probably something that we have to decide on an individual or collective basis when we gather in smaller groups or in other settings. There are moments when I feel we're getting closer, but then I look outside in the wider world and with the death of nuance and the intolerance of ambivalence, I think we're moving further away.
So that's another good question there. So coming through, from Jenny, if evolution has stopped, is the power base of money holding us back? And I think that's a really interesting thing I'd like to explore at some point. But I think yes, Jenny, but I also think for some reason, the vast majority of people who work in organizations don't understand that they actually have more power and choice than perhaps they realize. And that's one of the kind of features of the system. But I think it's a really interesting question.
Before we finish, Paul, would you mind just mentioning briefly the research you quote around the effect of, I think it was, of money and power on people's empathy? Because I think that ties in directly to this.
So if anyone's interested in that, a guy called Paul Piff runs a lab at the University of California, Irvine, and he researches the effect of power and status on individuals. And it turns out that the more power you have, even if you were a pretty well-adjusted individual coming into that leadership role or career, the more power you get, you will ultimately become a bit of an asshole, even if you didn't want to be. You will become more detached. You will become less empathetic. You will become more likely to condone unethical behavior. And you will think of people in the end as just numbers and costs on an org chart somewhere. And all of these, have been borne out by Paul's experiments over the last sort of 10 or 15 years. That it is fascinating. And I personally think that most of the things we blame on this abstract concept called culture are actually more to do with power and hierarchy. We're actually looking in the wrong place for the conflict.
So one thing we haven't touched on as much as I'd hope we would is the role of shame. And I kind of want to just pull this in. I noticed we've got the lovely David Bellamy with us. And David, you know that I've really enjoyed your post recently about Harkin on LinkedIn. And some of the stuff that David's written about, to me, shine a light on part of the shadow in organizations, which is the sheer unbearable discomfort of some of those who are in senior roles in organizations when it comes to the reality of what it is like for people who work for them becoming visible, and the way in which shame bends leaders out of shape, because it's impossible for them to talk about what they don't know and the fact that they can't live up to their own expectations, let alone anybody else's. That, in a sense, is one layer of undiscussable. But the other bit that then we have to connect that to is, to what extent do we as practitioners really wrestle with our own shame and our own anxiety? And my own work with practitioners leads me to the view increasingly that we have a lot more work to do there than we actually think we do. That the moment you become aware, and I've done this, you become aware of the fact that actually maybe I have said to a client I know more about something than I really do, that is tapping into my own fragility, my own vulnerability, the own existential dread of a consultant, which is that I may not work again, or I may not get enough work, or I may not be as good as I think I am, or the client thinks I am. So the shame and anxiety piece here is something that we don't talk about enough, in my view. I'm conscious of time. Alex, are we just praying from client shame and vulnerability? That's a great question. That's probably one for another whole 3-hour session. So before we finish, I want to thank you all for hanging with us for this period. We toyed with whether to make it smaller than this, but we felt we wanted to have as many people here as we could, just to see what would happen. Just to flag to you, those of you who want a kind of a more reflective and more spacious environment to talk about some of this, the next thing that I will be doing, just to flag it to you, is going to be with Mark Hughes. So Mark is one of the most interesting academics and practitioners and researchers in organisational change from the last 30 years. He wrote one of the seminal papers on why the figure of 70% of all change programmes failing is a total load of tosh. And Mark is going to be joining me for an hour and a half. He's coming out of retirement to do this because he's actually been retired since 2019, but he still has energy. It will be an interesting and quite deep conversation because there'll even be a bit of a pre-read. We'll be reading a chapter of his to prepare yourselves. So you will get details of that either my LinkedIn profile or if you sign up to my newsletter, but I'll also send out details when I send you details of the recording as well. So for those of you who want to go deeper into one slice of this, this will be the next thing that I do in July. And that is about it. So in the last 2 minutes, just to say thank you, Paul, for joining. Thank you, Andrew, for holding our hands and pulling the strings. Anything anyone who wishes to say in the last minute to close, feel free. That's probably all we've got before we all run away.
There was just a question in the chat about do we have access to the chat afterwards?
Yes, I'm going to download the chat. Unless there's any objections, I'm going to download the chat and make it available. I'm going to make available the Slido stuff. You'll get the recording. And if there's anything else that you want me or Paul to do, if you want something that is longer and more inquiry based, then tell us. This was the first thing. Me and Paul have been talking about what might wider conversations about this stuff be like, what shape might they take. So we're up for people saying, well, this is what we'd be interested in. So see this as the start of a conversation, not as a concluding point.
Absolutely.
I'm seeing already some yeses there. So thanks all.
Thanks, everybody.
Love to see old faces and new.
Take care.